My name is Walter Hendricks, and before I tell you what happened last spring, you need to understand one thing about me. I am not a man who enjoys conflict. I spent 31 years as a large animal veterinarian in rural Montana, and if there's one thing that job teaches you, it's patience. You cannot rush a horse that doesn't want to be touched. You cannot force a cow to trust you. You wait. You listen. You let the animal come to you on its own terms. That patience served me well for most of my life. It did not, however, prepare me for Deborah Whitfield. Let me back up. I own 320 acres out past the county line, land that's been in my family since my grandfather homesteaded it back in the 1930s. It's not fancy. It's not a resort ranch with a fountain out front. It's working land, cattle, hay fields, a creek that runs along the eastern border, and a farmhouse my father built with his own hands in 1958. I raised my kids there. I buried my wife Carol on a little rise near the tree line, under an oak she planted the year we got married. That land means more to me than anything money could buy. About 5 years ago, a developer bought up a stretch of pasture bordering my property to the north and turned it into a gated community called Silver Ridge Estates. Big houses, 3-car garages, manicured lawns that guzzle more water in a week than my cattle drink in a month. I didn't think much of it. Different world, different people. Live and let live. That's always been my motto. Then Deborah Whitfield became president of the Silver Ridge Estates Homeowners Association, and my quiet life got a lot louder. I first met her about 2 years ago. She showed up at my gate uninvited, driving a white SUV so clean it looked like it had never touched a gravel road, wearing sunglasses even though it was overcast. She introduced herself as the HOA president and informed me, not asked, informed me, that the association was considering a road improvement project that would benefit the whole community. I remember being polite that day, maybe too polite. I offered her a glass of water. I explained a little about the ranch, how long it had been in my family, how the pastures were arranged for rotational grazing so the cattle didn't overgraze any one section. She nodded along, but I could tell she wasn't really listening. Her eyes kept drifting past me toward the open stretch of land behind the house, like she was already picturing asphalt where my hayfield stood. I told her I appreciated the visit, but I wasn't part of her association, and whatever project she had in mind didn't concern me. She smiled in that way people do when they've already decided you're going to lose. "Oh, Mr. Hendricks," she said, "I think you'll find it concerns you very much." I asked her directly what she meant by that. She just tapped the folder under her arm, mentioned something about logistics being finalized soon, and got back in her SUV without another word. I stood in my own driveway watching her drive off and thought, well, that was strange. But strange isn't the same as alarming, not to a man who spent his life around unpredictable animals and unpredictable weather. I should have listened closer to that sentence. At the time, I brushed it off as small-town bluster. I had cattle to feed and a fence line to mend. I didn't have the bandwidth to worry about a woman in a golf visor. That was my mistake. About 8 months later, I got a notice in the mail from the county, a public hearing regarding a proposed access easement. I nearly threw it in the burn pile with the rest of the junk mail, but something made me open it. Good thing I did, because buried in 3 pages of bureaucratic language was a request from the Silver Ridge Estates HOA to establish a permanent road easement across the southeastern corner of my property. My property, not community land, not county land, mine. Turns out, the developer had built Silver Ridge with only 1 road in and 1 road out, and that road bottlenecked badly during rush hour because it fed onto a 2-lane highway with a blind curve. Deborah Whitfield and her HOA board had apparently decided the fix was to cut a second road straight across the corner of my ranch, connecting their subdivision to a county road on the far side of my property. Shorter commute for them. Convenient for them. Never mind that it would run within 200 yards of my equipment barn and cut directly through a hayfield I've cultivated for 3 decades. I went to that public hearing loaded for bear. I brought my deed. I brought survey documents. I brought 40 years of county tax records proving that land was mine, free and clear. No easements on file, nothing granting anyone right of passage. Deborah Whitfield stood up in that meeting in a blazer the color of a stop sign and gave a speech about community growth and shared infrastructure and reasonable accommodation for a growing neighborhood. She talked like she was doing me a favor. She even said, and I remember this word for word because it made my blood run cold, "Mr. Hendricks has more land than he could possibly need. Surely he can spare a strip of it for the greater good. More land than I could possibly need. as if 320 acres of working ranch was some kind of hoarding offense, as if the cattle grazing on it and the hay feeding them through winter didn't count as a legitimate use, simply because it wasn't a subdivision full of vinyl-sided houses. When it was my turn to speak, I kept it short. I told the board that I'd farmed and ranched that land my whole life, that my family had held clear title to it since before Silver Ridge Estates was even a name on a developer's blueprint, and that I had never been approached with any purchase offer, any lease proposal, or any request for consent. I said plainly that the answer was no, and that it would remain no. Deborah tried to interject, saying the HOA had budgeted for the project already, and that residents were counting on the improved access. I told her that budgeting for something you don't have permission to build doesn't create a right to build it. A few chuckles went around the room at that, which didn't seem to sit well with her at all. The county board, to their credit, denied the easement request that night. No agreement, no purchase offer, no legal right-of-way. The chairman told her plainly that without the landowner's consent, the HOA had no authority to build anything on private property, and he strongly suggested the HOA look into alternate solutions, like negotiating a proper easement with fair compensation, or petitioning the county to widen the existing entrance instead. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. About 6 weeks later, my ranch hand, a young man named Cole who's been with me 3 seasons, came running up to the house one morning looking like he'd seen a ghost. He told me there were bulldozers on the south pasture. I drove down there myself, and sure enough, there were 2 pieces of heavy equipment, a crew of 6 men in orange vests, and stakes with pink survey ribbon marking a path straight through my hayfield, the exact route the county had rejected weeks earlier. The morning air still had that early chill to it, the kind that usually meant a good day for moving cattle. But instead of tending my herd, I was standing at the edge of a hayfield, watching diesel exhaust curl up into a clear blue sky. I got out of my truck, and there was Deborah Whitfield, standing beside the foreman with a clipboard, looking as comfortable as if she were standing in her own driveway. "Mrs. Whitfield," I said, keeping my voice level even though my hands were shaking, "would you like to explain to me why there's construction equipment on my land?" She barely looked up from her clipboard. "This is community access infrastructure, Mr. Hendricks. We received an updated ruling." "There was no updated ruling. I was at that hearing. The board denied your request." "That was the county board," she said, like she was explaining something to a child. "The HOA has its own governing authority over shared access corridors within the development's original platting documents. Our lawyer says the original platting from 1991 shows this stretch as a potential utility and access corridor. Now, I want to pause here and tell you something important, because this is the part where a lot of people would have either panicked or gone straight to yelling. I did neither. Years of dealing with spooked livestock taught me that the worst thing you can do when someone's trying to provoke you is give them exactly the reaction they're hoping for. So instead, I smiled, a small, calm smile, and said, "Is that right? Well, I'd love to see that document. Because my deed, which is filed with the county recorder's office and has been since 1934, shows no such corridor. And unless your lawyer can produce a legally executed easement signed by me or any prior owner of this land, every one of these men needs to leave my property in the next 10 minutes, or I'm calling the sheriff for criminal trespass." She laughed. Actually laughed, like I'd made a joke. "Mr. Hendricks, we've already invested significant funds into this project. The community needs this road. I'm sure once it's finished, you'll understand it benefits everyone, including you." I didn't argue further. I pulled out my phone and I called the sheriff's department right there in front of her, told them exactly what was happening. Unauthorized construction equipment on private deeded ranch land, no easement on file, landowner explicitly refusing consent. It took the deputies about 25 minutes to arrive, which felt like the longest 25 minutes of my life, mostly because I spent it standing in my own hayfield, watching a bulldozer idle 6 feet from a fence I'd built with my late wife's brother back in 2003. When the deputy arrived, it didn't take him long to sort things out. He asked Deborah for documentation proving legal right of access. She produced a printed packet from the HOA's attorney, referencing that old 1991 platting map. The deputy looked it over, looked at my recorded deed, and shook his head. "Ma'am," he told her, "this platting document you're referencing was for the developer's original parcel. It doesn't extend onto adjoining private property that was never part of that development. This land belongs to Mr. Hendricks, and it has for decades. You do not have legal authority to build on it." She protested. She said the community had already been told the road was coming, that residents were expecting an alternate entrance within the month, that stopping now would cost the HOA thousands of dollars in wasted contractor fees. The deputy was polite but firm. "Everything stops, right now, or everyone present gets charged with trespassing, and the HOA itself could be looking at civil liability for property damage on top of that." The crew packed up. The bulldozers rolled off my land, tires chewing fresh ruts into the field on their way out, which struck me as almost fitting given how the whole morning had started. Deborah Whitfield stood there glaring at me like I was the unreasonable one, like I'd ruined her plans out of spite rather than simply defended what was legally, unquestionably mine. Before she left, she turned back toward me and said, "This isn't over, Mr. Hendricks. The community needs this road, and one stubborn rancher isn't going to stand in the way of progress forever." I didn't respond. I've found over the years that some people only hear what confirms what they already believe, and there's no sense wasting breath trying to change that in the moment. I simply watched her SUV disappear down the drive and went back to checking my fence line, half expecting and half dreading that this wouldn't be the last I heard from her. I figured that would be the last of it. I was wrong again. 3 weeks later, Cole came to get me from the barn, and this time it wasn't bulldozers, it was gravel trucks. A full crew, this time with what looked like a proper contractor's permit sign staked into the ground. I drove down there furious, ready for round 2, and what I found honestly took my breath away. They'd gone around the far side, through a stretch of my property I don't check as often because it borders a seasonal creek bed that's usually too soft to build on. Deborah Whitfield had apparently found a private surveyor willing to argue that portion of the boundary was ambiguous, and rather than going through any proper legal channel again, she'd simply had her HOA authorize construction on a Sunday, banking on the fact that most county offices are closed, and it'd take me time to get anyone official out there. They had already laid about 60 yards of compacted gravel roadbed straight across my back pasture by the time I arrived, cutting my ranch in half, running within shouting distance of my late wife's resting place under that oak tree. I stood at the edge of that unfinished roadbed for a long moment before I said a word to anyone. I looked toward the rise where Carol was buried, at the oak tree she'd planted as a sapling the spring we got married, and I thought about how she used to sit under that tree in the evenings with a cup of coffee, watching the cattle graze, telling me this was the most peaceful place on earth. And now there were gravel trucks idling within a stone's throw of it, kicking up dust that drifted right toward her headstone. That was the moment my patience, 30 years in the making, finally ran out. I didn't yell, I didn't threaten anybody. I did something much more effective. I told the foreman, calmly, that he and his crew needed to leave immediately, and that I would be pursuing legal action against both the HOA and his construction company for trespassing and property destruction. I got names. I got the company's information off the trucks. I took photographs of everything: the equipment, the gravel, the tire tracks through my pasture, the distance from the roadbed to my wife's grave marker. Then I called my nephew Grant, who happens to be a real estate attorney in Billings. Grant drove out that same evening after hearing what happened, and by the time he left, we had a plan. See, here's the thing about my land that Deborah Whitfield never bothered to research. My property isn't just any old parcel. It's registered with the state as a working agricultural operation, and it includes water rights tied to that creek running along my property, rights that have been in my family since before Montana was even a state highway system existed. Grant explained that not only had the HOA committed trespass and property damage, they'd also potentially violated state water rights law by disturbing the creek bed without any environmental review. We filed a formal cease and desist. We filed a police report for the criminal trespass and property damage, this time with photo documentation and witness statements from Cole. And Grant, being the thorough man he is, filed an emergency injunction with the county court, which was granted within 48 hours, legally barring the HOA, its board members, and any contractor working on their behalf from setting foot on my property without written consent. But here's where the story gets good. Once that injunction was granted, I had a choice to make. I could simply let the matter rest there, force the HOA to remove their 60 yards of illegally laid gravel road, and move on with my life. Or I could make sure Deborah Whitfield never forgot the lesson. I chose the second option. Under the terms of the injunction, the HOA was legally required to remove all equipment and materials from my land within 30 days, at their own expense, and restore the pasture to its original condition. Grant made sure that restoration clause was airtight. Full reseeding, soil compaction remediation, the works, all paid for by the HOA's insurance and out of their own operating fund since the board had acted without proper legal authority. That 60 yards of gravel road that was supposed to connect Silver Ridge Estates to the county road on the other side of my property, it got ripped out entirely, every last stone hauled away. The pasture reseeded with proper native grass mix, at their expense, supervised by an agricultural inspector I insisted be present for the whole process, just to make sure they didn't cut corners. And because the injunction was permanent, not temporary, that road plan was dead. Not paused, not delayed. Dead. Silver Ridge Estates would never have their shortcut through my ranch. Ever. I heard through the grapevine, small towns talk, you understand, that the HOA board held an emergency meeting after the injunction was finalized, and there was talk of removing Deborah Whitfield from her position as president. Apparently, several residents were furious to learn the board had authorized an unpermitted construction project, spent community funds on equipment rental and contractor fees, and exposed the entire association to a lawsuit, all without ever securing so much as a signature from me. Grant told me later that several Silver Ridge homeowners had actually reached out to his office independently, wanting to know if they, as individual dues-paying members, had any right to recoup the wasted funds directly from Deborah and the board members who'd approved the project without proper authorization. Nothing ever came of a formal claim against her personally, since board decisions are typically protected under the association's own governing documents. But the mere fact that people were asking the question told me the trust inside that neighborhood had taken a serious hit. I later found out from a Silver Ridge resident, a kind woman named Nancy, who occasionally rides horses at a stable near my property, that the whole ordeal ended up costing the HOA close to $18,000 once you factored in the wasted construction costs, the mandatory restoration, and the legal fees from fighting my injunction, a fight they lost decisively. Deborah Whitfield did step down from the board about 2 months later, right around the time several homeowners started asking pointed questions at meetings about exactly who had approved spending community assessment funds on a project that was never legally authorized in the first place. As for me, life went back to something like normal. Cole and I reseeded and repaired the fence lines by early summer. The cattle didn't seem to mind that a small chunk of pasture had briefly become a construction site. Cows, it turns out, are far more forgiving than homeowners associations. I still see Deborah Whitfield occasionally, from a distance, at the feed store or driving through town. She doesn't wave anymore. I don't particularly mind. People sometimes ask me if I regret how far things went, whether I feel bad that a woman lost her HOA presidency over the whole affair. And honestly, I don't feel much of anything about that part. What I feel strongly about is this. My grandfather cleared that land with a mule and a hand plow. My father built a house on it with his own 2 hands. My wife is buried under an oak tree on a hill that overlooks the creek she loved. That land isn't just property to me. It's family. It's memory. It's roots that go 3 generations deep into Montana soil. Nobody gets to bulldoze through that because it's convenient for their morning commute. If there's a lesson in all this, I suppose it's a simple one, the kind of thing my father used to tell me when I was a boy, learning to run this ranch. Just because something would be easier for someone else doesn't mean it's yours to take. And just because a person shows up with a clipboard and a confident tone of voice doesn't mean they've got the law or the right on their side. I built a life on this land through patience, hard work, and respect for what came before me. When someone tried to pave straight through the middle of that, I didn't need to shout or make a scene. All I needed to do was stand my ground, know my rights, and let the law do exactly what it was designed to do. Deborah Whitfield wanted a shortcut through my ranch. Instead, she got a dead end, an $18,000 bill, and a lesson she'll probably remember for the rest of her life. And me? I got my land back, exactly the way my family always intended it to stay, whole, untouched, and mine.